There is a version of the First World War that lives in photographs. You have seen it. Men in khaki standing stiff and formal before the camera, some barely old enough to shave, their expressions carrying a kind of earnest gravity that looks almost theatrical from this distance. Recruitment posters with clean lettering and bright colors, officers on horseback, the word glory used without embarrassment, printed in newspapers that had never been anywhere near a trench. That version of the war was constructed carefully, maintained aggressively, and believed because people needed to believe something that large could mean something that clear. It did not mean something that clear. It did not mean much of anything at all, in the end, except the particular way that industrial civilization discovered it could consume human beings and keep its paperwork in order while it did so. What actually happened between 1914 and 1918 was something different from the story. It was slower. It was wetter. It smelled worse. It lasted longer than anyone had said it would, and when it was over, it was not over in any way that mattered, because the systems that had produced it were still running, and the men who had survived it were carrying things inside them that had no name in any medical textbook that existed at the time. The war did not end. It paused. And while it paused, the institutions that had managed it filed their reports, counted their numbers, and moved on. This is the story of what the official version left out. It is not a story of heroism, because heroism is a category that the men who actually lived through the trenches rarely used when they described what they had done. It is a story of machinery, of systems, of the cold, indifferent logic of mass mobilization applied to human bodies at a scale that had never been attempted before, maintained through bureaucratic structures that were designed to process men the way a factory processes raw material. In and out, counted and categorized, filed and forgotten. To understand what the war actually was, you have to go back to what it was supposed to be. In the summer of 1914, when the diplomats and generals were drawing their plans and sending their ultimatums, the dominant expectation on all sides was that the fighting would be short. 6 months, perhaps less. The professional military men of Europe had studied their Clausewitz and their Napoleon, and had concluded that modern warfare, with its railways and telegraphs and magazine rifles, would produce rapid, decisive engagements. Armies would clash. One would break, and the political situation would be resolved. That was the theory. The theory was wrong in almost every respect, and the people who held it knew it was wrong almost immediately. But the institutional momentum of the war was already so large by the time the reality became undeniable that there was no mechanism for stopping it. The armies had mobilized. The trains were running. The supply chains had been established. To stop would have required an admission of error at a scale that no government was prepared to make, and so the war continued, long past the point where any honest accounting would have declared it a catastrophe. The Western Front in the autumn of 1914 looked nothing like what anyone had planned. After the initial German advance through Belgium and northern France was halted at the Marne in September, both sides began what military historians call the race to the sea, each army trying to outflank the other, each attempt failing, each failure producing a new line of fortifications slightly further north, until the two armies had dug themselves into a continuous line of trenches stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border, 440 miles. A scar across the continent that would not move significantly for the next 4 years. The trench itself was the central fact of the war on the Western Front. And it is worth understanding what a trench actually was, because the word has become so familiar that it has lost its physical meaning. A trench was a hole in the ground. Sometimes it was a well-constructed hole with wooden duckboards on the floor and corrugated iron revetments holding back the walls and fire steps built into the front face where men could stand and look toward the enemy line. Sometimes it was nothing more than a shallow scrape in the earth that a man had dug with his entrenching tool under fire, just deep enough to provide some cover against the rifles and machine guns that were trying to kill him. Between the two opposing trench lines was no man's land. The name came from an old legal term for unowned ground, And it had a grim appropriateness in this context, because no man's land was where men went to die. It varied in width from a few dozen yards to several hundred, depending on the sector. It was crossed by coils of barbed wire, first on one side, then on the other, then in multiple overlapping bands that reduced movement to a crawl. In active sectors, it was cratered by artillery, the ground broken into irregular humps and hollows that offered shelter and concealment, but also disorientation. In quiet sectors, it grew a strange vegetation, weeds and wildflowers reclaiming ground that had been cleared of everything else. And in no man's land, in the craters and the wire and the spaces between the fighting, there were the dead. Not all of the dead had been recovered. Many could not be recovered because attempting to retrieve a body under fire meant risking additional bodies, and at some point, the calculation became straightforward. The dead stayed where they fell. They became part of the landscape. They were noted in unit diaries with the same tone used to note weather conditions or ammunition expenditure. 3 killed, the diary would record. Or 2 other ranks missing, presumed killed. The bureaucratic language of institutional death, applied to individual human beings, day after day, month after month, for 4 years. The soldier who walked out of no man's land alone is not a single man. He is a category. He is every man who crossed that ground and survived it when the probability said he should not have, who came back carrying what he had seen and was then required to continue as though what he had seen was manageable. The army needed him to continue. The army needed everyone to continue. There was no provision in the military structure for the possibility that what they were asking men to endure might exceed what human beings were actually capable of enduring. By 1915, the nature of the war had been clearly established, and the men who were fighting it understood what it was in a way that the civilian populations at home did not and could not, because the communication systems that existed between the front and the rear had been designed, almost from the beginning, to manage information rather than transmit it. Letters were censored. Newspapers were given controlled access to the front and wrote controlled descriptions of what they saw. The official photographs, carefully selected and staged by the War Office, showed mud and effort, but not bodies. Not the specific textures of specific dead men. Not what a man looked like after he had been caught in a barrage. Not what remained in a trench after a gas attack had passed through it. The men knew. The men at home did not know, or knew only in the abstract way that one knows something when the concrete reality of it has been systematically withheld. This gap between what the soldiers knew and what the civilians understood was one of the defining characteristics of the war, and it produced a particular kind of silence in the men who survived it. Not the silence of men who had nothing to say, but the silence of men who had concluded that what they had to say could not be heard, because the distance between experience and language was too large to cross. Let us talk about the mud. The Western Front ran through the low-lying agricultural land of Belgium and northern France, land that had been drained over centuries by an intricate system of ditches and culverts. When the artillery began and continued, it destroyed those drainage systems. The shell craters filled with water, the fields turned to bog. In the Ypres salient, which was below sea level in some places, the water table was so high that it was impossible to dig a trench without hitting water within a few feet. The men built their positions above ground, behind sandbag walls and earth parapets, which meant they were constantly visible against the skyline and constantly under fire. The mud of Passchendaele in 1917 has become almost mythological, and there is a temptation to treat it as a kind of extreme, an exceptional condition that represented the worst the war produced. It was not exceptional. It was a more intense version of what existed across the entire front, all the time. Men drowned in shell holes, not metaphorically. They fell into the water-filled craters that covered the landscape after prolonged bombardment and could not get out because the sides were liquid mud that gave no purchase, and if they had been wounded they had no strength to pull themselves clear, and if no one came to help them, they died there, slowly, in the dark, in the cold. This happened with enough regularity that it appears as a standard entry in unit casualty reports. Missing believed drowned in shell hole, a bureaucratic category for a specific kind of death. The physical conditions of trench life, apart from the mud, included cold, because the trenches were open to the weather and the men spent days in them without adequate shelter. They included wet feet because the duckboards that were supposed to keep men above the standing water in the trench bottom were frequently absent, damaged, or inadequate. They included a condition that the medical services called trench foot, which was what happened when men stood in cold water for extended periods. The feet would swell and go numb, and then the tissue would begin to die, producing a condition that ranged in severity from painful blistering to gangrene requiring amputation. The treatment was simple: dry feet, rest, circulation. The trench provided none of those things, and so trench foot was endemic throughout the war, appearing in the casualty statistics as a medical condition rather than a wound, which meant it did not count toward the official tally of battlefield casualties. Lice were universal. Every man in the trenches had them. The lice lived in the seams of uniforms and in the seams of skin, and they were impossible to eliminate because the conditions that produced them were impossible to change. Men spent their rest periods running candle flames along the seams of their shirts, trying to kill the eggs, a process called chatting, from the Old English word for louse. The lice were not merely uncomfortable, they carried disease, including a condition called trench fever that produced recurring high temperatures and severe pain in the muscles and bones and took men out of the line for weeks at a time. Trench fever was caused by a bacterium carried in louse feces, and it was not identified and understood until 1918, by which point it had disabled hundreds of thousands of men on both sides. Rats were universal. The trenches were full of them, large, well-fed rats that had grown fat on the food the armies left behind and on other things that the armies also left behind. The men hated the rats with a specific personal hatred that comes through clearly in the letters and diaries that survived the war. The rats would cross men's faces in the night. They gnawed at equipment and rations. They were impossible to drive away because there was always more to bring them back. Some men hunted them with improvised weapons as a way of managing the rage that had nowhere else to go. The smell of the trenches was something that men who had experienced it described with a consistency that suggests it was overwhelming and distinctive and unlike anything else they had encountered. It was a compound smell, made up of many things. Mud, the particular kind of churned, organic mud of a landscape that had been shelled and destroyed and was slowly composting itself. Cordite from the shells and the rifles. Chloride of lime, which was used as a disinfectant and a deodorant in the latrines and on the ground where men had died, and which became, for many veterans, an indelible sensory trigger for the entire experience of the war. And underneath all of that, the smell of the bodies that had not been recovered, that were in the walls of the trenches in some sectors, absorbed into the structure that the men lived in, present and unavoidable. The artillery was the defining experience of the war more than any other single element. More men were killed by artillery than by any other weapon. More men were psychologically destroyed by artillery than by any other weapon. The shell, arriving without warning or direction, expressing no individual will, simply occupying the space where a man happened to be standing, was the purest expression of the war's essential character. You could not fight artillery. You could not outwit it or outrun it. You could only endure it, or fail to endure it, and the outcome was determined by factors that had nothing to do with courage or skill, or any quality the individual soldier possessed. It was geometrical. You were here, and the shell was there, and whether those 2 points coincided was a matter of calculation, not of character. The sound of artillery is something that requires description, because it was not simply loud. It was physically invasive. A barrage of sufficient intensity produced concussive waves that could knock men off their feet, that disrupted breathing, that caused bleeding from the nose and ears, that produced a physical sensation in the chest that men described as being hit by something invisible. A prolonged barrage, lasting hours or days as the pre-attack bombardments did, would produce a state in the men under it that went beyond fear into something more fundamental. A dissolution of the organizing structures of the mind. A regression to the most basic animal state, in which the only reality was the next few seconds, and whether the next shell would land close enough to kill. The British Army's preliminary bombardment before the Battle of the Somme in 1916 lasted 7 days. It was the largest artillery action in British military history to that point. The guns fired over 1.5 million shells into the German lines along a front of roughly 14 miles. The commanders believed it would destroy the German wire, collapse the German dugouts, kill enough German defenders that the infantry who followed would be able to walk forward and take the empty ground. General Haig, who commanded the British forces, described himself as satisfied with the preparations. On the 1st of July 1916, at 7:30 in the morning, the whistles blew along the British lines, and the men climbed out of their trenches and began to walk across no man's land toward the German positions. The German defenders were not dead. Most of them had survived in their deep dugouts, cut into the chalk below the reach of the shells. The German wire had not been cut. It had been thrown into the air by the explosions and had come down again in tangled masses, sometimes thicker and more impassable than before. The German machine guns, which had also survived, opened fire on the advancing British infantry, and the British infantry died. By the end of the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the British Army had suffered approximately 57,000 casualties, of whom approximately 19,000 were dead. It was the single bloodiest day in British military history. The British advance on that day was measured in hundreds of yards in some places, and in nothing at all in most places. The gap between the expectation and the reality was so large that the official reports could not bridge it with language, and so the language was simply adjusted. Gains were described. Objectives were listed as achieved when they had not been achieved. The casualty figures were reported in ways that obscured their scale. The war continued. What happened to the men who survived the 1st of July is in many ways more significant than what happened to the men who did not, because the men who survived had to keep going. The Battle of the Somme did not end on the 1st of July. It continued until November. For 4.5 months over the same ground in the same conditions, the armies fought for a maximum advance of 7 miles. The cost on the British side alone was over 400,000 casualties. The French, who were also fighting on the Somme, added another 200,000. The Germans, defending, suffered losses of comparable scale. All of this was recorded. All of this was processed. The paperwork was maintained throughout. The men who went into the trenches in the summer of 1916 and came out the other side, if they came out at all, were different from the men who had entered. Not in any way the army recognized or had language for. The official medical understanding of psychological injury from combat was, in 1916, extremely limited and largely hostile. The condition that would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder had been observed in men from the beginning of the war, with symptoms that were consistent enough to have been given a name, shell shock, though the name itself was misleading because it implied a physical cause that not all cases had, and because it created a false distinction between the psychological damage done by shells and the psychological damage done by everything else. The Army's initial response to shell shock was to treat it as either a physical injury, for which the man could not be blamed, or as cowardice, for which he absolutely could. The distinction was made by medical officers whose training had not included anything that would help them make it accurately, and whose institutional pressures were all in the direction of returning men to the line rather than removing them from it. A man, who was shaking uncontrollably and could not speak, who had been found wandering in no man's land, unable to identify himself or remember what unit he belonged to, might be diagnosed as a genuine shell shock case if his symptoms were sufficiently dramatic, or he might be diagnosed as a shirker if the medical officer had seen too many men that week and was behind on his paperwork. Some of the men who were diagnosed as cowards and returned to their units were court-martialed when they subsequently failed to perform their duties. Some of those court-martialed men were shot. The British Army executed 306 of its own soldiers during the war, the majority for desertion or cowardice, and among those executed were men who were, by any modern diagnostic standard, suffering from severe psychological trauma that had made them incapable of the behavior the army was demanding of them. This was known in some form at the time. There were medical officers who testified at courts-martial that the men being tried were mentally unwell, that they had been damaged by what they had experienced, that shooting them would solve nothing and explain nothing. These testimonies were sometimes accepted and sometimes not. The executions continued. The men who were not executed, who kept functioning, who went back into the line after each leave or each rest period and continued to do what was asked of them, were doing something that the official narrative celebrated as duty and courage and the British character. What they were actually doing was something more complex and less comfortable. They were adapting, not in the positive sense of the word, but in the biological sense, in the way an organism adapts to a hostile environment by changing the mechanisms it uses to process reality. Men who had been in the trenches for a long time described a numbness, a flattening of emotional response, a difficulty feeling things that had once been easy to feel. They stopped being able to grieve for men they knew who died. They stopped being afraid in the acute, specific way that fear operates in normal life. They developed instead a generalized, constant, low-level awareness of risk that was always present and never fully resolved, which is not the same thing as fear, but which is also not the same thing as courage. Letters home from the front are one of the best sources for understanding what the experience was actually like, and they are also a deeply compromised source, because the men who wrote them were writing for censors, writing for families who they knew could not understand and who they did not want to burden, writing in the knowledge that words like fine and well were expected and that words like terrified and broken would require explanations they could not give. The letters are full of gaps, full of things that are mentioned and then not pursued, sentences that seem to turn away from something in the middle. Men wrote about the weather, about the food, about men they had met from their hometown, about small domestic details of trench life that were manageable and communicable. They wrote around the center of what they were experiencing because the center could not be put in a letter. Some men kept diaries. The army frowned on diaries because they contained operational information that could be useful to the enemy if captured, but men kept them anyway. The diaries are different from the letters. They are sometimes more explicit, sometimes more compressed, sometimes more strange, in the way that private writing becomes strange when a person is trying to record things that do not fit the available categories. The diary of a man who has been in the trenches for 6 months and has watched dozens of men he knew die does not sound like the diary of a man who is coping in any conventional sense. It sounds like the record of a person whose relationship to the normal coordinates of experience, time, identity, cause and effect has been fundamentally altered. The rotation system the British Army used meant that infantry units spent a certain number of days in the front-line trenches, then were rotated to the support trenches, then to reserve, then to billets behind the line for rest. The system was designed to manage the physical exhaustion that trench service produced, and it did that imperfectly, but recognizably. What it was not designed to manage, and what it did not manage, was the psychological accumulation of experience over time. A man who rotated through the front line, the support line, and the reserve, and then back again, over a period of months and years, was accumulating something with each cycle. The army did not have a framework for acknowledging that accumulation or for deciding when it had reached a point beyond which more rotation would not produce a functional soldier, but would produce a damaged one. The concept of a tour of duty with a fixed endpoint, after which a man would be removed from combat permanently, did not exist in the British Army in the way it came to exist in later conflicts. Men served until they were killed or wounded severely enough to be evacuated to England or until the war ended. That was the structure. Within that structure, there were leaves and rest periods, but there was no provision for the idea that a man might have endured enough, might have accumulated enough, might have reached the end of what a human being could absorb and continue to function. The army needed men, and the men it had were the men it used, and when those men stopped working as soldiers, the army's mechanisms for processing that failure were punishment, not treatment. Gas was introduced to the Western Front in April 1915, when the German army released chlorine gas along a 4-mile front near Ypres. The gas, greenish-yellow, heavier than air, rolled along the ground in a visible cloud toward the Allied lines. The men who encountered it had no masks, no filters, no preparation for what gas did to a human body. They ran. Some ran far enough and fast enough to survive. Some did not. Chlorine gas destroys the respiratory system. It reacts with the moisture in the lungs to form hydrochloric acid, which burns the tissue. Men who were caught in chlorine and survived described the sensation of drowning while still on their feet, of lungs filling, of the desperate, futile effort of trying to breathe something that was actively destroying the mechanism of breathing. The men who died from chlorine died slowly, over hours or days, coughing blood, their faces purple with the effort of trying to move air through airways that were progressively swelling shut. Within months, both sides were using gas, and within a year the technology had expanded to include phosgene, which was more lethal than chlorine, and mustard gas, which worked differently from the others. Mustard gas was not primarily a lethal agent, though it killed some of the men it affected. Its primary function was incapacitation. It did not work immediately, which was part of its design. Men would be exposed to mustard gas and feel nothing for several hours. Then, the blistering would begin. The gas settled on exposed skin and clothing, and reacted with the tissue, producing large, painful blisters that covered the skin, the eyes, the mucous membranes of the throat and lungs. Men who were exposed to mustard gas were often blind for weeks. They were unable to move without extreme pain. They required intensive nursing care. The military value of mustard gas was that it persisted in an area for days or weeks, contaminating the ground and anything that rested on it, making a sector unusable. Its secondary military value was that it overwhelmed the medical services. A man killed by mustard gas occupied one bed in one casualty clearing station for a few days. A man disabled by mustard gas occupied a bed for weeks or months, required constant care, consumed medications and dressings and nursing time on a scale that was completely disproportionate to the number of men involved. Gas accounted for roughly a quarter of all British casualties in the war, but the proportion of medical resources it consumed was far higher than that. The gas mask became one of the defining objects of the First World War, as universal and essential as the rifle. Men were required to carry their masks with them at all times, to be able to put them on within seconds of the alarm being given, to maintain them in working condition in an environment that was actively hostile to delicate equipment. The masks were hot, difficult to breathe in, and reduced visibility, which meant that wearing them while trying to fight was a significant physical and tactical handicap. Men who did not get their masks on quickly enough when gas came died. Men who got them on but had a faulty seal or a damaged filter died more slowly. The machine gun is not a weapon that requires much explanation, but it requires some, because its role in the First World War was so central that understanding the war requires understanding what the machine gun did that no previous weapon had done. The machine gun made frontal assault against a defended position catastrophic in a way that had no precedent. A single well-positioned machine gun with a crew of 2 men and an adequate supply of ammunition could fire 400 or 500 rounds per minute and could maintain that rate of fire more or less indefinitely. A man crossing open ground toward a machine gun was, at any distance below about 1,000 yards, simply a target. His speed of movement, his skill, his courage, his training were all irrelevant. The mathematics of the situation was one-sided in a way that made traditional military thinking about the relationship between attack and defense obsolete. The generals and commanders of the First World War knew this. Most of them had observed the machine gun's capabilities in previous wars. The American Civil War, The Boer War, the Russo-Japanese War had all demonstrated what the machine gun did to infantry advancing across open ground. The lesson had not been fully absorbed into military doctrine, not because the generals were stupid, though some of them were, but because there was no good answer to the machine gun except artillery sufficient to destroy the machine gun positions before the infantry advanced, and the artillery of 1914 and 1915 was not always sufficient for that. And because the alternative to advancing, which was not advancing, was not an option that the military and political structures of the time could contemplate, because not advancing was losing, and so the infantry advanced, day after day, week after week, over the same ground, toward the same machine guns, suffering the same casualties, gaining the same yards, or failing to gain them. The casualty returns were processed. The gaps in the units were filled with new men. The advance would be tried again. The battles of attrition, a phrase that appears in the military histories as a description of the strategy that emerged when the armies found they could not break through, is one of the coldest phrases in the language of war. Attrition means wearing down. It is the strategy of choosing to sustain losses at a rate that you believe your enemy cannot sustain, trusting that his resources will run out before yours do. It is a strategy that requires the commanders who implement it to think about their own soldiers as a resource, the same way they think about shells or horses or miles of wire, as something that is spent in the pursuit of an objective, as something that is replenishable. This was not a new way of thinking in military terms. Armies have always consumed men. But the scale at which it happened in the First World War, and the degree to which it became bureaucratized, formalized and operationalized, was different from anything that had come before. There were tables and projections. Staff officers made calculations about how many men a given attack would cost, and those calculations were used in the planning process. And the men whose deaths were being calculated were not privy to the calculation. They received their orders, and they followed their orders. And if the calculation had been that a certain percentage of them would die in the process of following those orders, that was the calculation. And the fact that they did not know they were part of it did not change their status within it. The supply of men was the central logistical challenge of the war on the British side, because Britain had entered the war with a small professional army and had to build a mass army from scratch while simultaneously fighting. Lord Kitchener's recruitment campaign of 1914 and 1915 raised over 2 million volunteers, men who enlisted because they believed in the cause, or because they felt the social pressure to enlist, or because they were unemployed, or because their friends had gone, or because the recruiter was persuasive, or for dozens of other reasons that had nothing to do with a clear understanding of what they were volunteering for, because no one could tell them, because the people who knew could not say, and the people who were saying did not know. The PALS battalions were a specific feature of the British Volunteer Army that produced a specific kind of tragedy. In the first months of the War Office encouraged men from the same town, the same neighborhood, the same workplace, the same club, to join up together and serve together. The logic was that men would fight better alongside men they knew. The result was that when a battalion suffered heavy casualties, as every battalion eventually did, the losses were concentrated in a single community. The men of Sheffield or Accrington or Grimsby, who had all joined together as a local patriotic gesture, would all die together in the same attack, and the women who had waved them off at the railway station would all receive their telegrams in the same week. This was recognized as a problem relatively quickly, but the battalions had already been formed, and the damage, when it came, had already been done. Conscription was introduced in Britain in January 1916, the first compulsory military service in British history. The Military Service Act required all unmarried men between the ages of 18 and 41 to serve. A subsequent act extended this to married men. The act included provision for conscientious objectors, men who refused military service on grounds of conscience, and those men were required to appear before tribunals to establish the sincerity of their objection. Some were exempted, some were assigned to non-combatant duties, some were imprisoned, Some were sent to France under arrest and placed in combat situations with orders to fight or be shot. The state had decided it owned its men's bodies in a way that it had not previously claimed, and the men who disagreed were processed by the system until they complied or were destroyed. At the casualty clearing stations and the base hospitals, the work of sorting the damage was done. The medical services of the First World War managed an extraordinary volume of casualties, and in many respects, the medical advances produced by the war were significant and lasting. Blood transfusion, the treatment of sepsis, the management of gas gangrene, plastic surgery for facial wounds, orthopedic surgery for shattered limbs, all of these were developed and refined under the pressure of treating wounds on a scale and of a severity that peacetime medicine had never encountered. The surgeons and nurses and orderlies who worked in those facilities performed, by any objective measure, a remarkable amount of good in impossible conditions. And yet the context in which they worked was one of such systematic human damage that the good they did existed always in relationship to the damage. Thousands of men were made physically whole enough to be returned to the line. That was the explicit goal of the medical services in the military context, not the recovery of the man as a person, but the restoration of the soldier as a unit. A man with a leg wound who was repaired sufficiently to walk was returned to his unit when he could walk. A man with a hand wound who was repaired enough to hold a rifle was returned when he could hold a rifle. The criteria were functional and they were military, and the medical services operated within those criteria because those were the criteria the institution had given them. Shell shock, that inadequate and contested name for the psychological damage the war produced, became one of the most contentious medical and military issues of the entire conflict. By 1917, the number of men being evacuated from the front with psychological symptoms had become a significant drain on manpower, and the Army's response was to tighten the criteria for diagnosis and to establish new treatment facilities close to the front line, on the principle, developed by a military psychiatrist named William Rivers among others, that men treated near the front had better outcomes than men evacuated to England. The principle was correct as a clinical matter, but it was also convenient as a military matter because men treated near the front could be returned to their units more quickly. William Rivers himself was a complex figure who understood more clearly than most of his colleagues what was happening to the men in his care. He treated the poet Siegfried Sassoon at Craiglockhart War Hospital in Edinburgh in 1917, and the relationship between the two men has been extensively described and analyzed, because it was one of the few cases in the historical record where the internal experience of a man under treatment was articulated clearly enough to survive. Sassoon had written a formal declaration refusing to return to military service, a statement of principled objection to the war itself, and the army had dealt with it not by court-martialing him, which would have given his protest publicity, but by declaring him neurasthenic, which allowed them to send him to hospital and wait for him to recover his senses and agree to go back. Rivers helped him reach that decision, or something that looked like that decision, and Sassoon returned to the front. Rivers knew exactly what he had done, and it occupied him for the rest of his life. The men who were diagnosed with neurasthenia, with shell shock, with hysteria, with neuritis, with all the other names the medical system used for the psychological damage the war produced, were processed through a system that ranged in its treatment approaches from the genuinely therapeutic to the simply cruel. Electric shock therapy was used on men who had lost the ability to speak or to move limbs that had no physical wound. The therapy was not designed to torture, but it was often experienced as torture, and the mechanism by which it sometimes worked was not understood, and was possibly nothing more than the creation of a pain sufficiently acute to override the symptom. Men were threatened, hectored, and humiliated in attempts to restore their ability to function. The logic was that the incapacity was in some sense chosen, or at least maintainable by choice, and that sufficient pressure would reverse it. For some men, some of these approaches worked, in the narrow sense that the man's symptoms improved enough for him to be returned to duty. Whether they worked in any deeper sense, whether the man was actually better or simply more effectively suppressed, was a question that the medical services of the time were not equipped to ask, and that the army was not interested in having answered. The war produced its own category of soldier who was neither dead nor properly alive in the military sense. The man who had been in the line too long, who had accumulated enough, who was still technically present and functional, but was operating on a surface so thin that the smallest additional weight would break through it. These men were visible to the people around them, to their fellow soldiers, who recognized the signs because they had seen them in themselves. But they were largely invisible to the institutional systems designed to manage them. They did not present with clear, classifiable symptoms. They reported for duty, they ate their rations, they cleaned their weapons, they followed orders, and inside the mechanism of their continued functioning was something that was not going to hold indefinitely, but that had not yet failed in a way the system could recognize. The Battle of Passchendaele, the Third Battle of Ypres, as it is formally known, which took place from July to November of 1917, has become synonymous with the specific horror of the war because it combined, at extreme intensity, every element that made the war what it was. The ground was the worst possible, low-lying and already thoroughly churned by years of fighting and drainage destroyed by years of shelling. The weather was unusually wet, even by the standards of a Flemish autumn. The offensive was a strategic concept that made sense on paper, the idea being to break through the German lines and reach the Belgian coast and deny the Germans the submarine bases there, and which was extended month after month in the face of evidence that the breakthrough was not coming because the commitment of resources had become too large to abandon without someone being responsible for the abandonment. Men at Passchendaele died in the mud in ways that have been described in enough survivor accounts to establish a consistent picture, which is that the experience of fighting in that particular landscape was different even from other parts of the Western Front. Different in the quality of the horror, in the specific way it reduced men to something below the categorical, something that was not yet dead, but was no longer fully a person in any recognizable sense. Men carried their wounded companions through the mud and dropped them when they could not carry them further, and the companions sank, and the men who had carried them continued forward or continued back and wrote about it or did not write about it and lived with it or did not live with it. The official communiques during Passchendaele described the fighting in the standard language of advance and consolidation and enemy resistance overcome. The ground gained was measured in hundreds of yards. The village of Passchendaele itself, the name that became the name of the entire battle, was a collection of ruined buildings on a low ridge that had been reduced by the time the Canadian Corps finally took it in November to almost nothing recognizable as a village. The gain was approximately 5 miles. The cost was something over 300,000 British and Commonwealth casualties, with comparable losses on the German side. Field Marshal Haig, when he visited the front during the battle and saw for the first time the ground over which the infantry was being asked to advance, reportedly broke down in tears. Whether this report is accurate has been debated, but the fact that it was reported and believed says something about the gap between the planning maps in the headquarters and the terrain that soldiers were navigating. The planning took place in buildings with tables and paper. The fighting took place in a landscape for which no map was adequate. These two things were separated by a distance that was not only geographical. The French mutinies of 1917 are one of the most significant and least discussed events of the entire war, because they represent what happens when the gap between what is being asked and what is possible finally becomes visible enough to produce action. Following the catastrophic Nivelle offensive in April 1917, an attack on the Chemin des Dames that promised a decisive breakthrough and delivered instead another slaughter, large portions of the French army refused to attack, not refused to serve, not refused to hold the line, refused specifically to participate in further offensive operations that were identical in concept and outcome to the operations that had been producing mass casualties for 3 years without achieving the objectives that had justified those casualties. The mutinies affected roughly half of the French army's divisions in some form. Men presented their officers with lists of grievances. They refused to leave their trenches when ordered into attack. In some units there were meetings, speeches, Red flags. The French government and military high command treated the mutinies as a catastrophic secret, because if Germany had known the French army was in open revolt along significant portions of the front, the war might have ended differently. General Pétain, who was brought in to replace Nivelle, responded to the mutinies with a combination of actual reforms, better leave policies, better food, a genuine reduction in the senseless offensive activity, and prosecution. In the end, 499 men were sentenced to death, of whom 55 were actually executed. The rest of the sentences were commuted or suspended. The mutinies were successfully suppressed and successfully concealed. They were not reported in the French press. They were not reported in the Allied press. They were removed from the official history of the war to the extent that was possible, which was considerable, because the men who had been involved were aware that speaking about them was dangerous, and many of them did not speak about them until decades later, and some of them never spoke about them at all. The official version of 1917 in the French sector was that the army had faced difficulties following the Nivelle offensive, and that the new command had stabilized the situation and implemented necessary improvements. This was true in the narrow technical sense, and was entirely misleading about the nature of what had actually happened. The United States entered the war in April 1917, following Germany's resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare and the disclosure of the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany proposed a military alliance with Mexico. The American entry was significant for the Allies primarily as a signal of eventual reinforcement, because American troops were not available in large numbers immediately. The process of building, training, and transporting an army was a lengthy one, and through most of 1917, the American presence in France was more symbolic than material. What the American entry represented, in terms of the war's internal logic, was an extension of the system that had already consumed the young men of Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the other belligerents, now applied to a new population of men who had not yet been through it. The men who went to France from America in 1917 and 1918 arrived with the same expectations that the British and French and German soldiers had carried in 1914. The expectations shaped by patriotic narrative and military ceremony, and an understanding of war derived from sources that had little relationship to what the Western Front actually was. They encountered the Western Front, and they learned faster than the 1914 men, because the infrastructure of industrial killing was already mature, what it meant. The black American soldiers who served in the First World War served in segregated units, largely under white officers, in conditions that combined the standard horrors of the Western Front with the specific degradation of being required to fight for a country that applied the same racial logic to them that it applied everywhere else. Many black American soldiers were assigned to labor battalions and never saw combat. Those who were placed in combat units served with distinction by any military measure. When they returned to the United States, the country they returned to was the same country they had left. The Red Summer of 1919, in which racial violence broke out in cities across America, killing hundreds of black people, was not the homecoming that had been promised to the men who had served. It was not discussed in the official accounts of the war's legacy. The war in the air, which tends to produce different imagery than the war in the trenches, the individual aircraft, the lone pilot, the vocabulary of knighthood and chivalry that was applied to aerial combat almost from the beginning, was in its essential character continuous with the war on the ground. The aircraft of 1914 were fragile, slow, and limited. By 1918, they were fast, heavily armed, and effective killing machines. The life expectancy of a new pilot arriving in France during certain periods of the air war, periods like Bloody April of 1917, when the Royal Flying Corps lost a third of its strength in a single month, was measured in days. The average was approximately 11 days of combat flying before a pilot was shot down. Like the infantry, the pilots who survived the initial exposure period and developed tactical skill could extend their survival considerably, but the pool of men who made it through those first weeks was small. The fighter aces, the men whose names and scores appeared in the newspapers and who were used as propaganda figures to embody the heroic narrative that the industrial reality of the war was constantly undercutting, were genuine phenomena in the sense that they existed and did what they were credited with doing. They were also statistical outliers in a system that was consuming men at a rate that made individual achievement largely irrelevant to the outcome. Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, shot down 80 Allied aircraft before he was shot down himself in April 1918. The 80 men or thereabouts who were in those aircraft were not discussed at the same length or with the same care as Richthofen himself, because they were the subject and not the story. The naval war, which tends to receive less attention than the Western Front in the popular memory of the First World War, had its own particular character, defined largely by the submarine. Germany's decision to use submarines against Allied shipping, initially with restrictions and eventually without them, was one of the most strategically significant decisions of the war, and it nearly worked. By the spring of 1917, German submarines were sinking Allied merchant ships faster than they could be replaced, and the calculations being made at the British Admiralty suggested that if the rate continued, Britain would not be able to continue the war past the autumn. The crisis was resolved by the convoy system, which grouped merchant ships together under naval escort and drastically reduced losses. But the period before the convoy system was implemented was one of genuine strategic danger. The men who died in the submarine war died in ways that are specific and different from the ways men died on land. A torpedo hitting a ship in the engine room produced an explosion that could kill instantly, or produce flooding that sank the ship in minutes, or start fires that burned through the ship while men tried to get to lifeboats that might not be there, or might be damaged, or might be in water that was too cold to survive in for more than a few minutes. The survival rates from ships sunk by submarines varied widely depending on the circumstances, but the average was not high, and the men who survived often survived in ways that left permanent marks. The home front, which is the phrase used for the experience of civilian populations during the war, was shaped by the same institutional logic that shaped everything else. The British government's management of public opinion, of food supply, of industrial production, of women's labor, of political dissent, was systematic and largely effective. The Defence of the Realm Act, passed in 1914, gave the government sweeping powers to control information, restrict movement, regulate industry, and prosecute people who said or did things that were judged to be harmful to the war effort. These powers were used extensively. The women who stayed at home while their fathers and brothers and husbands and sons were in France lived with the knowledge of the casualty lists, which were published in the newspapers, but which represented only a fraction of what was actually happening, and with the specific anxiety of waiting, which is its own kind of damage. The women who worked in the munitions factories, filling shells with explosive compounds that were toxic, and that turned their skin yellow, and that caused liver damage, and that would eventually kill some of them, were doing essential work that the war required, and were doing it in conditions that the factory owners and the government managed only to the minimum degree necessary to maintain production. The women who received the telegrams, those small pieces of official paper that began, "We regret to inform you," experienced something for which there was also no good language. Grief at this scale, repeated with this consistency across an entire social landscape, was something that societies had not previously had to process, and they did not process it very well. The idea of a clean, complete mourning, a beginning and an end and a grave to visit, was denied to many families because the bodies were not recovered, or were too damaged to be identified, or were buried in France or Flanders and were not coming home. The missing, as they came to be called, the men whose names were inscribed on the great memorials because there was nothing else to inscribe them on, represented a particular kind of loss that left those who mourned them without the conventional structures of mourning. The physical reconstruction of the Western Front landscape after the war was a massive enterprise that continued for years. The shell craters were filled. The wire was cleared. The bones that turned up in the ploughing were collected and reburied, and are still turning up 100 years later in the agricultural fields of Belgium and northern France. There are teams of specialists in the 21st century who are still recovering and identifying the remains of men killed in the First World War, men whose families have been dead for generations, whose names exist only on memorials and in archive records, being brought back into the accounting one at a time. The landscape of the Ypres salient, where some of the heaviest fighting occurred, was eventually restored to agricultural use, though not to its pre-war state. The drainage systems were rebuilt, the fields were replanted, towns were reconstructed, sometimes on slightly different plans than the originals, because the originals were too thoroughly destroyed to serve as blueprints. Ypres, which had been reduced to rubble by 1917, was rebuilt stone by stone in an attempt to recreate the medieval city it had been, and it now looks much as it did before the war. And at 8 o'clock every evening, the last post is sounded under the Menin Gate by the town's buglers, as it has been almost every evening since 1928. In memory of the 54,000 names carved on the gate, the names of men who died in the salient and whose bodies were never found. The last post, a military bugle call, played at the end of the day, signaling that the watches of the night are set and that those who are dead may rest. It is a ceremony of great beauty performed with great regularity, and it memorializes men who were killed by a system that regarded them as expendable, in a war whose causes were diplomatic and economic and political, and whose execution was bureaucratic and mechanical, and whose outcome did not justify what it cost. And the ceremony is beautiful, and the beauty does not address that, and is not intended to address that, because the purpose of the ceremony is not analysis, but commemoration, not understanding but continuity, not reckoning but ritual. The peace treaties that ended the First World War were signed in 1919, primarily at Versailles, where the major terms were dictated by the victorious Allied powers, principally France and Britain, with the United States playing a significant but ultimately incomplete role. The terms imposed on Germany were designed primarily by France, which had been invaded and occupied, and had lost the largest proportion of its young men in the fighting, and which had very specific ideas about what it needed from Germany in the way of security guarantees and financial reparations. The Versailles Treaty is often described as the cause of the Second World War, the punitive terms fueling the resentments that gave rise to German nationalism and eventually to Hitler. And there is something to this analysis, though it is more complicated than the straightforward causal chain suggests. What the Versailles Treaty represents, in terms of the internal logic of this account, is the end of the killing and the beginning of the accounting. The accounting was as selective and institutional as everything else about the war. The official histories were written over the following decades by committees working from official records, and the official records had been maintained throughout the war by men who understood that the records would eventually be histories and who made the records accordingly. The chaos and the failure and the institutional indifference and the systematic abuse of men by the systems that were supposed to be managing them in service of national interests were present in those records in attenuated form, visible if you knew where to look and how to read the official language of understatement and omission. The soldiers who came home, those who survived, returned to a world that had been changed by the war in ways that it had not yet understood. The economy had shifted. The social relationships had shifted. The women who had been working in factories and offices and nursing stations were not going back to the domestic arrangements that had preceded the war. Not entirely, not immediately. The political landscape had shifted, with the Russian Revolution having produced the world's first Bolshevik state, and with revolutionary movements active across Europe and Asia. The idea that the old structures, the monarchies and empires, and aristocratic military systems were either inevitable or sustainable had been severely damaged by what had just happened. The soldiers came home and found that the country they had fought for had a plan for commemorating them and no plan for helping them. There were hospitals for the physically wounded, though they were inadequate and underfunded almost immediately after the war's end, as the government's attention turned to the financial crisis produced by 4 years of industrial warfare. There was almost nothing for the psychologically damaged. The men who had walked out of no man's land, The men who had endured 4 years of the machine and survived it in body, if not entirely in mind, were expected to readjust to civilian life by the mechanism of readjusting to civilian life, to take up their previous occupations or find new ones, to marry if they had not already married, to function. Some of them did, in the narrow sense. Some of them built functional lives that looked, from the outside, like recovery. Inside those lives, things persisted. The intrusive memories that arrived without invitation, the difficulty sleeping, the hypervigilance that had been a survival tool in the trenches and was a social handicap in peacetime, the difficulty with emotional intimacy, which requires a kind of openness that prolonged exposure to organized death teaches a person to close down, the specific reactions to sounds, to smells, to sudden movements. The way in which, for some men, the world of peacetime never fully took on the quality of reality that the world of the trenches had had, so that civilian life was always in some sense theatrical, and the war was always in some sense still happening, still present, still ongoing. These men were not identified as a population with a specific shared condition. There was no post-traumatic stress disorder in the official diagnostics of the 1920s and 1930s. There were individual diagnoses, nervousness, neurasthenia, general debility, applied to men who presented with visible and persistent symptoms. There were the men who were committed to asylums, who were too obviously damaged to be maintained in the community. There were the men who found their way to alcohol or other substances that managed the experience of being inside their own minds without addressing what was creating it. And there were the men who were apparently fine, who went to work and raised children and attended church and participated in the civic activities of their communities, and who never told anyone what they had seen or what it had done to them, and who died in the 1960s and 1970s, in their 70s and 80s, taking the specific texture of what they knew with them. The war poets are the most familiar artistic legacy of the First World War, and they have a peculiar status in the cultural memory of the conflict, simultaneously celebrated as voices of authentic protest against the official narrative and contained within that narrative by the act of celebration, which domesticates what was originally a challenge. Wilfred Owen, killed 1 week before the armistice, whose poems about the specific physical realities of gas and mud and wounds are still read in schools as examples of the truth the war produced, wrote from inside the experience as a serving officer who returned to the front after treatment for shell shock because he felt he had an obligation to the men he commanded and a belief that his presence might make some difference. His poems did not change the war. His presence did not change the war. He died in the war. The poems survived and were published and were taken up by the culture as evidence of the war's true nature, and the culture continued. Siegfried Sassoon survived the war, returned to England, wrote his memoirs, became a figure of some literary celebrity, converted to Catholicism in his later life, and died in 1967. He lived long enough to see the First World War become history, to see his own experience become the subject of academic study, to see the things he had tried to say in 1917 become the received interpretation of the entire conflict. Whether this was satisfying to him in any deep sense is difficult to assess from the outside. He did not seem in his later years like a man who had made peace with what he had experienced and what he had witnessed. The poets who are remembered are not the only witnesses. There were tens of thousands of diaries and letters and memoirs, most of them unpublished, many of them in archives that are still being processed and catalogued a century later. There were paintings, drawings, sketches made in the trenches and behind the lines by men who had some facility with a pencil and who chose to use it to record what they saw rather than to process it in words. There were photographs, official and unofficial, that showed things the official photographs were designed not to show. There was an enormous body of material testimony that accumulated in the years after the war ended. The oral history projects and the recorded interviews and the television documentaries that began to appear in the 1960s and 1970s as the men who had served were in their 70s and 80s, and willing, finally, to talk in ways they had not been willing to talk before. What emerges from all of that material if you read it carefully and without the filter of the familiar narrative, is a portrait of an experience that exceeded the categories available for processing it. The men who went to the war were given a set of concepts: duty, honor, sacrifice, the defense of civilization, and those concepts did not correspond to what they found when they got there. What they found was a system, a large, indifferent, mechanical system that processed them as inputs and produced casualties as outputs, and maintained itself through the bureaucratic management of information and the institutional resistance to change. The system was not malevolent. It was not designed by evil people for evil purposes. It was produced by the application of industrial organization to military necessity, and it ran with the logic of all systems, which is the logic of its own continuation. The men who came back, who walked out of no man's land alone or in groups or not at all, who survived the system and were shaped by it in ways they could not fully articulate or understand, had been through something that the society that sent them had no framework for absorbing. The society absorbed what it could, which was the heroism and the sacrifice, and the rest it put in archives, in locked boxes, in spare rooms, in the unspoken territories of family life, in the silences of men who ate their Sunday dinners and drove their cars and read their newspapers and did not talk about the things they knew. The armistice that ended the First World War was signed at 11 o'clock in the morning on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, a time chosen for its symbolic symmetry, one of the few aesthetic considerations that the war's management applied to any of its operations. At 10:59, men were still being killed. In the few minutes before 11 o'clock, on the final morning of the war, there were men dying of wounds they had sustained the day before, men caught in barrages that were still falling because the orders had not yet reached the batteries, men shot by snipers who were firing until the final second because they were professionals, and that was what professionals did. At 11 o'clock, the guns stopped. The silence that followed was, by the accounts of men who were present for it, one of the strangest things they had ever heard. After 4 years of constant noise, of a sonic environment that had been so persistent and so overwhelming that many men had stopped registering it consciously, the silence had a physical quality. It pressed on the ears. It felt wrong. Men stood in it and did not know what to do with their faces. And then the war was over, and the men who were alive, and the men who were dead, and the records were in order, and the final casualty figures were eventually calculated, and the number arrived at, across all belligerents, was somewhere in the range of 20 million dead in military service, with another 20 million or more wounded, with another 50 to 100 million civilians dead from the flu pandemic that followed the war, and that moved through a world of weakened immune systems and disrupted sanitation and masses of displaced people moving across borders, and the total was a number for which there is no adequate response, except to note that it was a number, and that the systems that produced it continued, and that the next war was already being arranged.